For years the white cops of Oak Ridge strutted through the streets like untouchable kings, their badges a shield for every racist taunt and brutal act they inflicted, until they crossed Darius King. They saw a black man walking his dog, another easy target to harass, never suspecting he was a Navy SEAL forged in the fires of war. When their bullets took his loyal companion and their fists tried to break his spirit, they lit a fuse they couldn't extinguish. Now a hero's revenge is coming, and their careers will burn to ashes before they even see it ignite. The evening sun dipped low over Oak Ridge, casting a warm golden hue across the sleepy streets of the small American town. It was March 15, 2025, and the air carried the faint scent of blooming spring flowers mixed with the crisp bite of an early dusk. Darius King walked steadily along the cracked sidewalk of Elm Street, his boots tapping a quiet rhythm against the concrete. Beside him, Shadow padded along, the German shepherd's ears flicking at every rustle of leaves, his dark eyes scanning the world with the same vigilance Darius had trained into him over years of companionship. The leash hung loose in Darius's grip, a formality more than a necessity. Shadow didn't need it. He was a soldier in his own right, loyal to a fault, and as much a part of Darius as the scars etched into his skin from a decade in the Navy SEAL. Darius was 38 now, his broad shoulders and muscular frame a testament to years of brutal training and missions most men couldn't imagine surviving. His face weathered but sharp, a quiet intensity beneath the surface, a stillness that hid the storm within. He'd left the SEALs 3 years ago, trading covert ops for a simpler life as a mechanic in Oak Ridge, a town he'd chosen for its promise of peace. But peace, he'd learned long ago, was a fragile thing, especially for a black man in a place where some eyes still lingered too long, where some hands still tightened on purses or steering wheels when he passed by. He'd felt it before, the unspoken tension, the weight of being seen as a threat before he'd even opened his mouth. Tonight, though, he pushed it aside. It was just him and Shadow, the cool breeze, and the fading light. For once he let himself believe the world could stay still. The hum of an engine broke the quiet. Darius didn't turn at first, but Shadow's ears perked up, a low rumble vibrating in the dog's chest. Darius gave the leash a subtle tug, a silent command to hold steady, and kept walking. The sound grew closer, deliberate, not the casual drone of a passing car but the low, stalking crawl of something hunting its mark. He glanced over his shoulder just as the black and white cruiser rolled into view, its headlights cutting through the dusk like knives. Oak Ridge Pete. Darius exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He'd seen this dance before, too many times in too many places, but he kept his pace even, his posture relaxed. No sense in giving them what they wanted just yet. The cruiser slowed to match his stride, its tires crunching against the gravel-strewn edge of the road. The driver's window slid down and Officer Jack Brennan leaned out, his pale face framed by a buzz cut and a smirk that didn't reach his cold blue eye. Beside him, Officer Mike Sullivan stepped out from the passenger side, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. Sullivan was younger, leaner, but carried the same air of entitlement, his hand resting too casually near the baton on his belt. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Darius stopped walking, turning to face them fully, Shadow shifting to stand at his side, alert but still. "Evening, sir," Brennan drawled, his voice dripping with mock politeness as he rested an elbow on the window frame. "Mind telling us where you're headed?" Darius met Brennan's gaze, his own eyes steady, unblinking. "Home," he said simply, his tone flat but polite. "Just walking my dog," Sullivan snorted, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the sidewalk. "Home, huh? Don't think I've seen you around here before. You sure you're in the right neighborhood?" "I live 2 blocks up," Darius replied, nodding toward the row of modest houses ahead. "Been here 3 years." Brennan raised an eyebrow, exchanging a quick glance with Sullivan. 3 years, funny how folks around here don't seem to know you. We got a call about someone looking suspicious. Big guy, big dog, sounds like you." Darius tilted his head slightly, the barest hint of a smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes remained cold. "Suspicious," he repeated. "Walking my dog at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday. That's what passes for suspicious around here." Sullivan's smirk widened, but there was a sharpness to it now, a glint of something eager in his expression. "You'd be surprised what gets people nervous these days. That's a hell of a dog you got there. Looks like trouble." "Shadow's trained," Darius said, his voice calm, measured. Obedience, protection. He doesn't move unless I tell him to. Brennan chuckled, leaning further out the window. Protection? What's a guy like you need protection from in a nice little town like this? Darius didn't rise to the bait. He'd heard it all before, the veiled jabs, the insinuations, the way they danced around what they really wanted to say. He's my partner, he said simply. Keeps me company. Sullivan took another step forward, his hand brushing the baton now, his eyes flicking between Darius and Shadow. Partner, huh? Looks more like a weapon to me. Dangerous thing to be walking around with. He's not dangerous unless he needs to be. Darius replied, tightening his grip on the leash just enough to keep Shadow steady. The dog's ears were up, his body tense, sensing the shift in the air. Darius felt it too, the slow tightening of the moment, the way the officer's casual tone was fraying at the edges, giving way to something harder. Brennan straightened in his seat, his smirk fading. How about you show us some ID, just to make sure everything checks out? It wasn't a request. Darius exhaled slowly, reaching into his jacket with deliberate care, keeping his movements visible. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and handed it over to Sullivan, who snatched it with a flick of his wrist. The younger cop scanned the driver's license, his lips twisting slightly as he read. Darius King, Sullivan said, holding the ID up for Brennan to see. Says he lives on Maple Street. Guess he's telling the truth about that much. Brennan didn't look impressed. Says here you're ex-military. Navy SEAL, huh? That's supposed to mean something. Means I served, Darius said, his voice steady. Means I've got nothing to hide. Sullivan handed the wallet back, but not before giving it a mocking little toss that forced Darius to catch it midair. Served, huh? What's a big tough SEAL doing walking a dog in Oak Ridge? Shouldn't you be out saving the world or something? Darius tucked the wallet back into his jacket, his expression unchanged. Just trying to live my life. Brennan chuckled again, but there was no humor in it now, just a cold, calculating edge. Live your life. Right. Well, here's the thing, Darius. Folks around here get antsy when they see someone like you walking around with a dog like that. Makes them feel unsafe. Someone like me, Darius repeated, letting the words hang in the air. He didn't need to ask what Brennan meant. He'd heard it all his life in 100 different ways from 100 different mouths. Shadow let out a low growl, barely audible but enough to make Sullivan's hand twitch toward his holster. Control that mutt, Sullivan snapped, his voice sharper now, his patience fraying. He's controlled, Darius said, his tone firm but still calm. He's reacting to you. Brennan's eyes narrowed, and he stepped out of the cruiser, closing the distance between them. Reacting to us, huh? Maybe we ought to take a closer look at both of you, make sure everything's on the up and up. Darius squared his shoulders, his voice dropping slightly. You've got my address. I'm not breaking any laws. What exactly do you need? Brennan smirked, stepping into Darius's space now close enough that Shadow's growl grew louder, more insistent. What I need, he said, his voice low and menacing, is for you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. Just a little chat down at the station. Darius didn't move. On what grounds? Sullivan barked a laugh, his hand resting fully on his holster. On the grounds that I don't like your attitude, SEAL boy. Turn around. Shadow's growl turned into a sharp bark, his body tensing, ready to lunge. Darius tightened the leash, his voice cutting through the air with authority. Shadow down. The dog obeyed instantly, dropping to the pavement, but his eyes never left the officers. Brennan's smirk twisted into something uglier. See, that's the problem with dogs like that, too damn unpredictable. He's not the problem, Darius said, his voice steady but edged with steel now. You are. The air shifted. Brennan's hand dropped to his gun. Sullivan's followed, and Darius knew with the clarity of a man who'd faced death 100 times, that this wasn't going to end with words. Not tonight. The air on Elm Street thickened with tension, the golden dusk giving way to a darker, more ominous hue, as Officer Jack Brennan's hand hovered over his holster. Darius King stood firm, his broad frame unyielding, his dark eyes locked on the two white cops who'd turned a quiet evening walk into a battlefield. Shadow, the German shepherd at his side, obeyed his last command to stay down, but the dog's muscles quivered, his growl a low warning rumbling through the stillness. Officer Mike Sullivan's fingers twitched near his gun, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of something eager, something dangerous. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Brennan said, his voice a low growl now, his patience unraveling. He took another step closer, crowding Darius's space, daring him to react. "Turn around, hands behind your back. Now." Darius didn't flinch. "I've given you my ID. I've answered your questions. You've got no cause." Sullivan barked a laugh, sharp and brittle. "Cause? How about that damn mutt growling at us? That's cause enough." "He's reacting to you," Darius said, his tone steady but edged with a warning of its own. "Back off, and he'll calm down." Brennan's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't tell us what to do, boy. Control that dog, or we will." The word hit Darius like a slap, but he'd heard it before, too many times to let it break his composure. His hands tightened on Shadow's leash, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "He's controlled. You're the ones escalating this." Sullivan stepped forward, his gun half drawn now, his voice rising. "Escalating? You think you're in charge here? Turn around." Or, Shadow's growl turned into a sharp bark, a split-second reaction to Sullivan's movement. It was all the excuse they needed. Brennan's hand jerked to his holster, but Sullivan was faster. The gunshot cracked through the air, a deafening roar that split the quiet street in two. Shadow yelped, a sound so raw it tore through Darius's chest like shrapnel. The dog stumbled, his legs buckling, blood blooming across his black and tan fur as he collapsed onto the pavement. "No!" Darius's voice broke, a primal shout as he dropped to his knees beside Shadow, his hands pressed against the wound, warm blood seeping through his fingers, staining the concrete. Shadow's eyes, wide with shock and pain, locked onto his, searching for an answer. Darius couldn't give. "Stay with me, boy. Stay with me." Brennan stepped back, his gun still drawn, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Told you that mutt was a problem." Sullivan holstered his weapon, smirking again, the thrill of power returning to his expression. "Should have listened." Darius's world shrank to the fading breaths of the dog in his arms. Shadow's chest heaved once, twice, then stilled. The silence that followed was louder than the gunshot, heavier than anything Darius had ever felt. Not in the deserts of Afghanistan, not in the jungles of South America, not in any war he'd fought. His hands shook, slick with blood, as he stroked Shadow's head one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so damn sorry." "Get up," Brennan snapped, his tone sharp now, impatient. "You're coming with us." Darius didn't move. Not yet. The rage was there, boiling beneath his skin, but he'd been trained too well to let it take him. Not now. Not like this. He rose slowly, his bloodied hands hanging at his sides, his eyes burning into Brennan's. "You just made a mistake," he said, his voice low, lethal, a promise wrapped in every syllable. Sullivan laughed, stepping forward with his baton drawn. "Yeah, what's that?" Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to. Brennan grabbed his arm, wrenching it behind his back, and Sullivan swung the baton, aiming for his ribs. The impact sent a jolt of pain through Darius's side, but he didn't cry out. He'd taken worse. They shoved him toward the cruiser, their boots stomping the pavement, as if they owned it, as if they owned him. The cuffs clicked tight around his wrists, cutting into his skin, but Darius barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, already calculating, already planning. They threw him into the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut with a metallic clang. Brennan climbed into the driver's seat, smirking through the rearview mirror. "Tough guy, huh?" "Not so tough now." Sullivan leaned against the window, tapping the glass with his baton. "Should have kept that dog on a tighter leash." Darius said nothing. He stared straight ahead, his breath steadying, the storm inside him coalescing into something cold, sharp and unstoppable. They thought they'd won. They thought this was over. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As the cruiser pulled away, leaving Shadow's lifeless body on the sidewalk, Darius made a silent vow. Brennan and Sullivan would pay, not just with their badges, but with everything they held dear. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The Oak Ridge police station was a squat, gray building that reeked of stale coffee and unchecked power. Darius sat in the back of the cruiser as it rolled into the lot, his wrists chafing against the cuffs, his ribs throbbing from Sullivan's baton. The blood on his hands, Shadow's blood, had dried into a dark, sticky crust, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Brennan killed the engine, and Sullivan yanked the door open, dragging Darius out with a roughness meant to humiliate. Darius didn't resist. He let them pull him forward, his boots scuffing the gravel, his face a mask of calm that hid the inferno raging inside. "Move it," Sullivan barked, shoving him toward the station's rear entrance. Brennan followed, his gun still holstered, but his hand resting on it, a silent threat. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor. Officers at their desks glanced up, some with curiosity, others with indifference. This was routine for them. Another black man in cuffs. Another night of business as usual. They shoved him into a holding cell, the metal bars clanging shut behind him. Sullivan smirked through the gaps. "Get comfortable, SEAL. You're gonna be here a while." Brennan leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Should have kept your mouth shut out there. Might have saved your mutt." Darius stood in the center of the cell, his back straight, his eyes fixed on them. "You think this is over?" Sullivan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Over? Yeah, it's over for you. Sit tight and think about how you screwed up." Brennan's smirk returned, colder now. "We'll let you cool off. Maybe next time you'll know your place." They turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing down the hall, their laughter fading into the hum of the station. Darius didn't move. He stood there, the cell's concrete walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of sweat and defeat. But he wasn't defeated. Not even close. His mind was already working, piecing together the next steps, the angles, the weaknesses. He'd been in tighter spots than this. Caves in Afghanistan, with bullets raining down. Jungles with no backup for miles. This was nothing. This was a cage, and cages could be broken. Hours passed. The station quieted, the night shift settling into a lazy rhythm. Darius sat on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees, his breathing slow and deliberate. He replayed every moment, the way Brennan's hand had twitched toward his gun, the eagerness in Sullivan's eyes when he fired, the smugness in their voices as they dragged him here. They thought they'd won, because they always won. Not this time. The cell door clanked open just past midnight. A tired-looking officer stepped in, his badge reading Martinez. He uncuffed Darius without a word, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go," he muttered. "No charges." Someone called in a favor. Darius rubbed his wrists, the raw skin stinging under his touch. He didn't ask who. It didn't matter. He stood rolling his shoulders and walked out of the cell, past Martinez, past the desks where night shift cops avoided his gaze. The station's front doors loomed ahead, and he stepped into the cool night air, the weight of Shadow's absence hitting him like a punch to the gut. His truck was still parked 2 blocks from where it had happened. He walked the distance in silence, the blood stains on his clothes, catching the faint glow of streetlights. When he reached the spot, Shadow was gone. Someone had cleaned up the mess, erased the evidence of what Brennan and Sullivan had done. But Darius didn't need the body to remember. He knelt where Shadow had fallen, his fingers brushing the pavement, still faintly warm from the day's sun. "I'll make this right," he whispered, his voice steady now, resolute. "They'll pay." He stood, his jaw tightening, and climbed into his truck. The engine roared to life, a low growl that matched the storm brewing inside him. Brennan and Sullivan thought they'd broken him. They'd miscalculated. Darius King wasn't just a man who'd lost his dog. He was a Navy SEAL who'd lost everything that mattered. And now, they were the ones who'd be running. Darius King drove through the darkened streets of Oak Ridge, the rumble of his truck's engine a low counterpoint to the storm brewing in his chest. The blood on his hands had dried into a crust, flaking off as he gripped the steering wheel, but the weight of Shadow's absence clung to him like a second skin. The town slept around him, oblivious to the war that had just begun, its quiet houses and flickering streetlights a mockery of the peace he'd once sought here. He didn't head home, not yet. Home was a hollow shell now, a place where Shadow's leash still hung by the door, where the silence would scream louder than any gunshot. He pulled into the lot of a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, a neon sign buzzing faintly above the entrance. The place was nearly empty save for a lone waitress wiping down counters and a trucker hunched over a coffee mug. Darius slid into a booth near the back, his broad frame filling the space, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. The waitress approached, her expression softening as she took in his bruised face and blood-streaked clothes. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice quiet but not prying. Darius nodded once, his throat too tight to form words. "Coffee. Black." She didn't press further, disappearing behind the counter. Darius leaned back, forcing his breathing to slow, his mind to focus. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse. Not anymore. The SEALs had beaten that out of him years ago, replacing it with discipline, precision, and a cold, calculating patience. Brennan and Sullivan had taken Shadow, had humiliated him, had laughed as they dragged him away and cut. They thought they'd won because they always won, because the system was built to let men like them walk free. But Darius wasn't the system, he was something else entirely. The coffee arrived, steaming in a chipped mug. Darius wrapped his hands around it, the heat grounding him as his thoughts sharpened. He needed a plan, not just revenge but annihilation. Brennan and Sullivan wouldn't just lose their badges, they'd lose everything. Their careers, their reputations, their freedom. He'd make sure of it, and he'd do it his way, the SEAL way. Silent, unseen, unstoppable. First, he needed evidence. They'd covered their tracks before, body cams conveniently off, reports rewritten, witnesses silenced. But Darius knew men like them were sloppy when they felt safe, and they felt safe now. He'd use that against them. Cameras, small, hidden, untraceable, would be his eyes. He'd record every move they made, every word they spoke, every crime they thought they'd buried. And then he'd hit them where it hurt most, in the dark, where they couldn't see him coming. The diner door jingled and Darius's gaze flicked up. A woman stepped inside, mid-30s, sharp features, a leather jacket slung over her shoulder. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on him with a flicker of recognition. She slid into the booth across from him without asking, her posture casual but her expression hard. "Darius," he said, her voice low. "Heard you got out." "Lena," he replied, nodding slightly. Lena Carter was an old friend, a private investigator with a nose for dirt and a hatred for cops like Brennan and Sullivan. She'd been the one to call in the favor that got him released. "Thanks. Don't thank me yet," she said, leaning forward. "They're already spinning it. Dangerous, dog, threatening suspect. You know how this goes." Darius's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I know." Lena studied him, her dark eyes narrowing. "You're not letting this go, are you?" "No." She exhaled, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Good. I've got something you might want. Files on Brennan and Sullivan. Complaints, buried reports, stuff they thought was gone. It's not enough to nail them yet, but it's a start." Darius took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind already racing. "Get it to me. Tomorrow." Lena nodded, sliding a card across the table. "You're playing with fire, you know that?" He met her gaze, his voice steady. They lit the match. She didn't argue. She stood, gave him one last look and walked out. Darius finished his coffee, the plan solidifying in his mind. He'd start with their routines, where they went, who they talked to, what they did when they thought no one was watching. He'd build the trap, piece by piece, and when it was ready, he'd spring it. Brennan and Sullivan wouldn't just fall, they'd burn. The next morning, Darius woke before dawn. The ache in his ribs a dull reminder of the night before. His house was silent, the absence of Shadow's quiet breathing a void that gnawed at him. He didn't linger on it. Not now. Grief was fuel, and he'd use every drop. He dressed in dark clothes, a hoodie pulled low over his face, and packed a small duffel bag with gear from his SEAL days. Micro cameras, audio bugs, a burner phone. Simple tools, but in his hands, they were weapons. Lena's files arrived at 6 a.m., dropped off in an unmarked envelope by a courier who didn't ask questions. Darius spread the papers across his kitchen table, his eyes scanning the details. Brennan, 12 years on the force, a history of excessive force complaints, all dismissed. Sullivan, 5 years, younger but dirtier, linked to missing evidence and witness intimidation. They were a team, a pair of predators who'd thrived in Oak Ridge's shadows. The files gave him names, dates, patterns, enough to start tracking them. He began with their precinct. Oak Ridge PD was small, understaffed and lazy, perfect for men like Brennan and Sullivan to operate unchecked. Darius parked a block away, his truck blending into the early morning traffic. From the driver's seat, he watched them arrive. Brennan at 7:45, Sullivan 10 minutes later. They moved with the swagger of men who owned the place, laughing as they climbed out of their cruiser, oblivious to the eyes on them. Darius snapped photos with a telephoto lens, noting their habits. Brennan smoked a cigarette before heading inside. Sullivan checked his phone obsessively. Small details, but they'd matter. By noon he'd mapped their patrol route. They favored the east side of town, poorer, mostly black and Latino neighborhoods, where complaints rarely stuck. Darius followed at a distance, his truck a ghost in their rearview mirror. At 1 p.m., they stopped at a gas station, leaning against their cruiser as they hassled a young black man pumping gas. Darius watched through binoculars, his jaw tightening as Brennan shoved the kid against his car. Sullivan barking threats. No cameras, no witnesses, at least none they knew about. Darius slipped a micro camera from his bag, planting it on a nearby pole when they weren't looking. It was small, wireless, and would catch every move they made. That night, he reviewed the footage at home. The gas station clip showed Brennan pocketing cash from the kid's wallet, Sullivan laughing as they drove off. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. Darius needed more. He needed them to hang themselves. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in his eyes. Shadow's leash still sat on the counter, a silent motivator. "They're sloppy," he muttered to himself, "and I'm patient." He'd hit them soon, not with fists, not yet. First he'd build the noose. Brennan and Sullivan thought they were hunters. They didn't know they were prey. 2 days later, Darius made his move. He tracked Sullivan to a dive bar on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, a grimy hole where cops went to drink off the clock. Sullivan was a creature of habit. 9 p.m. 3 beers, then a stumble to his car in the back lot. No cameras, no lights, just shadows. Perfect. Darius parked a block away, his hoodie pulled low, his steps silent as he slipped into the alley behind the bar. He carried nothing but a pair of gloves and a collapsible baton, tools for a job that didn't need a gun. Sullivan emerged at 9:45, swaying slightly, his uniform swapped for a wrinkled jacket. He fumbled with his keys, muttering curses as he staggered toward his car. Darius waited, a shadow among shadows, until Sullivan was halfway across the lot. Then he moved, fast, silent, a predator closing in. The first strike was a baton to the back of Sullivan's knee, dropping him to the asphalt with a yelp. Before the cop could scream, Darius's gloved hand clamped over his mouth, the baton pressing against his throat. "You remember me?" Darius whispered, his voice low, lethal, his face inches from Sullivan's wide, panicked eyes. Sullivan thrashed, his muffled grunts, useless against Darius's grip. "Ho! Ho the hell!" Darius tightened the baton, cutting off his air. "The guy whose dog you shot, the guy you laughed at while he bled out." Recognition flashed in Sullivan's eyes, followed by terror. He clawed at Darius's arm, but the seal's strength was unyielding. Darius leaned closer, his breath hot against Sullivan's ear. "You're gonna wish you'd never pulled that trigger." He released the chokehold just enough for Sullivan to gasp, then drove a fist into his ribs, hard, precise, a crack echoing in the night. Sullivan wheezed, curling inward, but Darius wasn't done. A knee to the stomach doubled him over, and a final baton strike to the jaw sent him sprawling, blood pooling beneath his face. Darius stood over him, his breathing steady, his rage cold and controlled. "Tell Brennan this is just the start," he said, his voice a quiet promise. "You're not untouchable anymore." Sullivan groaned, barely conscious, as Darius slipped back into the darkness. The bar's back door stayed shut. No one had seen, no one had heard. He was gone before Sullivan could crawl to his feet, leaving the cop battered and broken in the dirt. The first strike had landed, and the message was clear. Darius King was coming for them. The morning after Sullivan's beating dawned gray and heavy over Oak Ridge, the sky thick with clouds that mirrored the tension brewing beneath the town's surface. Darius King sat in his truck, parked a discreet distance from the precinct, his hoodie pulled low, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He'd barely slept. The image of Sullivan crumpled in the alley replaying in his mind, not out of guilt, but satisfaction. It was a start, a crack in their armor, but it wasn't enough. Brennan was still standing, still strutting, still believing he was untouchable. That ended today. At 7:50 a.m., Brennan rolled into the lot, his cruiser screeching to a stop. He stepped out, his face tight with something new, anger, maybe fear. Sullivan trailed behind, limping noticeably, his jaw swollen, a dark bruise creeping up his neck. They moved slower than usual, their usual swagger replaced by a weariness Darius could feel even from a block away. He'd rattled them. Good. He snapped a photo with his telephoto lens, the timestamp marking their vulnerability. Darius had spent the night reviewing Lena's files and the gas station footage. The evidence was mounting, small crimes, yes, but enough to show a pattern. He needed more, something undeniable, something that would bury them. Brennan's routine gave him the opening. Every afternoon the cop stopped at a rundown auto shop on the east side, a front Darius suspected for something dirtier. Today, he'd find out. At 2 p.m., Brennan's cruiser pulled into the shop's gravel lot. Darius followed, parking behind a row of abandoned cars, his truck blending into the decay. Brennan stepped out, lighting a cigarette as he approached the garage. A wiry man in grease-stained overalls met him at the door, their handshake quick but low. Darius zoomed in with his camera, catching the exchange, a thick envelope passing from the mechanic to Brennan. Cash, he'd bet his life on it. The micro camera he'd planted earlier on a telephone pole across the street would catch the rest. The footage came alive on his laptop that night. Brennan pocketed the envelope, his voice muffled but clear enough through the camera's mic. Same deal next week. Keep it quiet. The mechanic nodded, disappearing inside. Darius leaned back, a cold smile tugging at his lips. Bribery. Extortion. It was a thread, and he'd pull it until their whole world unraveled. He chose Brennan for the second strike. The cop lived alone in a squat house on the edge of town, a place with no security, no cameras, just arrogance. At 11, Darius slipped through the shadows, his boots silent on the grass. Brennan's cruiser sat in the driveway, the house dark save for a faint glow from the living room. Darius circled to the back, picking the lock with a practiced flick of his wrist. Inside, the air stank of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Brennan sprawled on a couch, a bottle in hand, the TV blaring some late-night rerun. Darius moved like a ghost, the collapsible baton sliding into his grip. Brennan didn't hear him until it was too late. The first strike cracked against the cop's shoulder, sending the bottle crashing to the floor. Brennan roared, lunging up, but Darius was faster. A knee to the gut doubled him over, and a baton strike to the temple dropped him hard. Blood trickled from Brennan's brow as he gasped, clawing for the gun on the coffee table. Darius kicked it away, pinning him with a boot to the chest. "Recognize me now?" Darius growled, his voice low, controlled. Brennan's eyes widened, recognition hitting like a freight train. You son of a..." Darius pressed harder, cutting off his air. "You killed my dog. Laughed about it. This is what happens next." Brennan thrashed, his face red, but Darius held him down, his strength unyielding. "Sullivan got off easy," he said. "You won't." He released the pressure just enough for Brennan to breathe, then drove a fist into his jaw once, twice, until the cop's head lolled, dazed. Darius stood towering over him. "Tell your precinct they're next. You're done." Brennan groaned, blood pooling beneath him as Darius slipped out the back door, vanishing into the night. The message was sent. Now they'd panic. The precinct buzzed with unease. The next morning, a low hum of tension threading through the usual chatter. Darius watched from his truck, parked across the street, his telephoto lens trained on the chaos unfolding inside. Brennan stormed in at 8 a.m., his face a mess of bruises, his arm cradled stiffly against his chest. Sullivan followed, still limping, his swollen jaw making him look more like a beaten boxer than a cop. They moved straight to Captain Holt's office, their urgency palpable even through the glass. Darius couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. Their body language screamed fear, shoulders hunched, gestures sharp, eyes darting to the windows, as if they expected him to strike again. He'd hit them where they lived, where they drank, where they thought they were safe. Now they knew nowhere was safe. Inside, Brennan slammed a fist on Holt's desk, his voice carrying faintly through an open window. "It's him, I'm telling you. That Seal bastard." Holt, a grizzled man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "You've got no proof, Jack. You're saying some guy you hauled in beat the hell out of both of you." Sullivan's voice cracked, high and unsteady. "He knew us, Captain. Knew what we did. He's not just some pissed-off civilian." Holt's jaw tightened, but he waved them off. "Get your story straight and file a report. If it's him, we'll bury him." Darius smirked, lowering his lens. They wouldn't bury him. They couldn't. He'd already planted the seeds, and the footage was piling up. The gas station shakedown, the auto shop bribe, small crimes, but they'd lead to bigger ones. He knew men like Brennan and Sullivan didn't stop at petty cash. They were dirty, and dirt always ran deep. That afternoon he tailed them again. They were twitchy now, checking mirrors, snapping at each other as they patrolled. At a corner store, Brennan roughed up a teenage clerk, his temper flaring, while Sullivan pocketed a wad of bills from the register. Darius's camera caught it all, the lens hidden in a parked car across the street. The clerk's fear, Brennan's rage, Sullivan's greed. It was a portrait of corruption, frame by frame. Back home, Darius synced the footage to his laptop, adding it to the growing file. Lena's intel had given him names, other victims, other crimes. He cross-referenced them with the videos, building a timeline. A bar owner shaken down last month, a mechanic beaten for refusing to pay up, a kid arrested on trumped-up charges. Brennan and Sullivan weren't just rogue, they were a cancer, and Darius was the cure. He leaned back, his eyes drifting to Shadow's leash on the counter. "They're scared now, boy," he muttered, "just like they should be." The next strike came 3 nights later, surgical and swift. Darius had tracked Brennan to a warehouse on the edge of town, a spot Lena's files flagged as a drop point for dirty cash. At 10 p.m., Brennan's cruiser pulled up, the cop stepping out with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Darius watched from a rooftop a block away, his night vision binoculars cutting through the dark. 2 men, bikers by the look of their leather vests, met Brennan at the door, their handshake quick, the bag exchanged for a smaller envelope. Darius's camera rolled, capturing every second. Extortion, money laundering. Brennan was deeper than he'd thought. He waited until the bikers left, then moved. Slipping down a fire escape, he crossed the lot in silence, a shadow among shadows. Brennan was alone, counting cash by the cruiser's headlights. Darius struck, a baton to the back of the skull, dropped him instantly. The cop hit the gravel, groaning, and Darius pinned him with a knee to the spine. "You're predictable," Darius said, his voice low, cold. "That's your problem." Brennan gasped, blood trickling from his scalp. You're dead. You hear me? Dead." Darius twisted his arm, a sharp crack echoing as the joint strained. "Not yet, but you're running out of time." He left Brennan sprawled in the dirt, the duffel bag ripped open beside him, cash scattering in the wind. The camera caught it all, the exchange, the attack, the aftermath. Back home, Darius synced the footage, his collection growing. He had enough now, bribery, assault, theft, but he wanted more. He wanted their souls. Sullivan was next. The cop had taken to patrolling alone, his nerves frayed, his hands shaky on the wheel. At 1 a.m., Darius found him parked near a vacant lot, smoking a cigarette to calm his nerves. He approached from the shadows, silent, the baton sliding into his grip. Sullivan didn't see him until the first blow cracked against his ribs, sending him sprawling from the cruiser. Darius grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the hood. Still laughing, Darius growled, his face inches from Sullivan's panicked eyes. Sullivan choked, blood dripping from his lip. "Please, please, I didn't." "You did." Darius cut in, his voice a blade. "And now you pay." A fist to the gut, a knee to the face. Sullivan crumpled, whimpering. Darius stood over him, his breath steady. "Tell Brennan to watch his back." "I'm not done." He vanished into the night, leaving Sullivan broken and sobbing. The trap was tightening, and they were running out of places to hide. By the end of the week, Brennan and Sullivan were ghosts of themselves. Darius watched from afar as they stumbled into the precinct, their faces a roadmap of bruises, their eyes hollow with paranoia. The station buzzed with rumors, whispers of a vigilante, of cops being hunted. Captain Holt called them into his office again, his voice booming through the cracked door. "What the hell is going on?" Holt snapped, his fist slamming the desk. "You're falling apart out there." Brennan's voice was hoarse, desperate. "It's him, Captain King. He's doing this. He's everywhere. You've got no proof," Holt barked. "Just your damn word and a couple of beatings you can't explain." Sullivan's voice trembled. "He knows us. He knows what we did. He's not stopping." Holt leaned back, his scowl deepening. "Then find him. End this." Darius smirked from his truck, the telephoto lens catching their fear. They were cracking, and he'd barely begun. That night, he uploaded the footage, every clip, every crime, to a secure server, encrypting it with a SEAL-grade cipher. Lena met him at the diner again, her laptop open, her eyes wide as she watched. "This is gold," she said, scrolling through the files. "Bribery, assault, extortion. You've got them dead to rights." "Not enough," Darius said, his voice low. "I need them in cuffs." Lena nodded, tapping a key. "I've got contacts, reporters, activists. We leak this, they're done." "Do it," Darius said. "But not yet. I've got one more move." He hit Brennan again that night, catching him at the auto shop. The cop was jumpy, his gun drawn as he paced the lot. But Darius was faster. A baton to the wrist disarmed him. A fist to the jaw dropped him. Brennan groaned, blood pooling beneath him, his voice a ragged plea. "What do you want? Just tell me." Darius crouched, his eyes cold. "Your badge, your freedom, your life." He left Brennan there, broken and sobbing, the camera rolling. The breaking point had come, and now it was time to pull the trigger. The footage hit the internet at 6 a.m. on a Monday, a tidal wave crashing over Oak Ridge. Darius had timed it perfectly. Lena's contacts seeded the clips to local news sites, activist groups, and social media, each video tagged with Brennan and Sullivan's names. The gas station shakedown, the auto shop bribe, the warehouse drop, the beatings, every frame was raw, unfiltered, undeniable. By 8 a.m., the town was ablaze, hashtags trending, phones buzzing with outrage. Darius watched from a coffee shop across from the precinct, a burner phone streaming the chaos. News vans swarmed the station, reporters shouting over each other, protesters gathering with signs, "Justice for Shadow, end police corruption." Inside, Brennan and Sullivan stood in Holt's office, their faces pale, their voices rising in panic. "It's him," Sullivan yelled, his hands shaking. "He set us up." Holt's voice was a growl. "You idiots, you've dragged us all into this." The clip spread, hundreds of views turning to thousands, then millions. The gas station clerk came forward, then the bar owner, then the mechanic, their stories matching the footage. By noon, the mayor's office issued a statement. "We're investigating." Too late. The public had already decided. Darius sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. The precinct was fracturing, officers turning on each other, some defending Brennan and Sullivan, others distancing themselves. Holt stormed out, barking orders, but the damage was done. The trap had sprung, and they were caught. Brennan and Sullivan didn't go quietly. That night, they came for Darius, their cruiser screeching to a stop outside his house. He'd expected it. Men like them lashed out when cornered. He watched from his living room, cameras rolling, as they kicked the door in, guns drawn, faces twisted with rage. "Where are you, you bastard?" Brennan roared, sweeping the room. Darius stepped from the shadows, hands raised, his voice calm. "Right here." Sullivan lunged, his fist connecting with Darius's jaw, but Darius didn't fight back. Not yet. Brennan shoved him against the wall, his gun pressed to Darius's chest. "You think you can ruin us? You're done." The cameras caught it all. The break-in, the assault, their threats. Darius took the hits, his body absorbing the pain, his mind steady. "You're burying yourselves," he said, blood dripping from his lip. They dragged him outside, cuffs snapping tight, but the street wasn't empty. Neighbors watched, phones out, recording. "Let him go," someone shouted. The crowd grew, voices rising, and Brennan hesitated, his grip faltering. "Back off," Sullivan yelled, but the tide had turned. They shoved Darius into the cruiser, peeling out, but the damage was done. The footage hit the web within an hour, live proof of their desperation. The precinct imploded the next day. The new footage, Brennan and Sullivan breaking into Darius's home, went viral, millions watching as the cops' brutality played out in real time. Protests swelled, the mayor calling for their arrest, internal affairs swarming the station. Holt tried to spin it, claiming rogue officers, but no one bought it. The evidence was too damning. Darius sat in a holding cell again, his ribs aching, his face bruised, but he wasn't worried. Lena had the footage, the public had the truth. At 3 p.m. Martinez unlocked the door, his expression grim. "You're out." Again. Darius stood, nodding. "They're done, aren't they?" Martinez didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Outside, news vans clogged the streets, reporters shouting as Brennan and Sullivan were led out in cuffs, their faces pale, their powers stripped. The crowd cheered, a wave of triumph washing over Oak Ridge. The trial was swift, a formality after the evidence Darius had gathered. He took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted every moment. Shadow's death, the beatings, the break-in. The jury watched the footage, their faces hardening with each clip. Brennan and Sullivan sat silent, their lawyers grasping at straws, but the truth was ironclad. On the 5th day, the verdict came, guilty on all counts: excessive force, assault, breaking and entering, corruption. The judge's voice was cold as he sentenced them. 15 years each. No parole. You abused your power. Now you'll pay for it. Darius watched from the gallery, his expression unreadable. Brennan glared at him. Sullivan slumped, broken. They'd lost everything: badges, freedom, futures. Outside, the town celebrated, but Darius felt no joy, just closure. The cemetery lay quiet, under a fading sun, the air cool as Darius King approached Shadow's grave. The headstone was simple: Shadow, loyal forever, and he knelt beside it, a faded photo of the German shepherd in his hand. He ran his thumb over it, his breath steady but heavy. "You'd be proud, boy," he said, his voice low. "They're gone, every last one of them." The wind rustled the grass, a soft reply. Darius exhaled, placing the photo against the stone. "I miss you," he whispered, "but I made it right." He stood, the weight lifting, not gone, but lighter. Oak Ridge had changed, the corruption cracked open, the people awake. He'd fought for them, for Shadow, for himself. Now he could walk away. With one last look he turned and left, the dusk closing in behind him.